In 1860, most Americans considered the Great Plains to be the Great American Desert. Settlement west of Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Arkansas, and Louisiana averaged just one person per square mile. Over the next few decades, mining, the railroad, and the cattle industry brought many Americans west. One of the first things to draw many Americans west were mining booms in the West, beginning in California when gold was found there in 1848. By the time news reached the eastern part of the United States, it was 1849 when waves of Americans headed to California. That's why the football team in San Francisco is called the 49ers. The 49ers were Americans who traveled to California hoping to get rich finding gold. About a decade later, in 1859, gold was found in Colorado. And when mines dried up in places like California and Colorado, the miners didn't just go home. They moved on to the next mining town. So throughout this time period, boom towns, mining towns popped up throughout the West. Some of these mining towns included places like Aspen and Breckenridge in Colorado. Initially mining towns, today they're ski towns. In Montana, cities like Butte, Montana and Helena, and a little bit more close to home, Deadwood, South Dakota, began as a mining town. The hope of every miner or every prospector was to find a bonanza. A bonanza was a large deposit of some precious metal, usually gold or silver, sometimes copper as well. One of the biggest bonanzas found in the United States was in 1859 in Nevada. It was called the Comstock Lode. Whenever gold was discovered in an area of the West, it attracted miners that were already in the West, and new miners or prospectors that came from the East. And towns popped up around these gold or silver or copper mines, known as boom towns because they popped up seemingly out of nowhere. First the miners came, then they were followed by merchants looking to sell items to the miners. Those might be shop owners selling supplies for mining. They might be saloon owners or hotel owners. Many of the boom towns lasted after the mining was done in that area, but some of the towns didn't, and today exist only as ghost towns. These are towns that once were boom towns. They popped up to meet the needs of the miners in that area, and when the mines dried up and the miners left, so did everyone else. As more people populated the West, the need for communication between East and West grew. The Pony Express was a mail delivery service from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California. It carried messages, newspapers, and small packages across the Great Plains and over the Rocky Mountains and Sierra Nevadas. It reduced the time for messages to travel from coast to coast to about 10 days. Pony Express stations were located about 10 miles apart, which was the distance that a horse could gallop at continuously before tiring. A Pony Express rider would carry messages from one station to the next before passing off his parcel to the next rider, or before getting onto the next horse and continuing on himself. The Pony Express advertised to get riders to join up. They actively sought orphaned children because they had no parents or no family to care about them. And they looked for young children or young teenagers because they were lighter and could be carried faster without as much strain on the horse. However, the Pony Express did only last for a short 18 months before it shut down. It was ultimately replaced by the telegraph system, which could pass messages from east to west coast almost instantaneously. In order to improve transportation across the West, the Transcontinental Railroad was begun in 1863. It took about 6 years to complete. The final spike was driven in 1869, and it connected east to west from Omaha, where the Union Pacific started, to Sacramento, where the Central Pacific part of the Transcontinental Railroad began. The two legs of the Transcontinental Railroad each encountered a variety of difficulties along the way, and the two companies actually had a bit of a competition to see who could cover the most distance most quickly. The Central Pacific started in Sacramento, as we said earlier, and was worked primarily by Chinese immigrants. Chinese immigrants who were hired for a number of reasons. One, they were very, very cheap labor. They were also considered to be replaceable. After all, the view was China had lots of population, lots of potential railroad workers that could work very cheaply. So if one of these Chinese laborers was lost, was killed in a rock slide or in an explosion, it wasn't considered a great loss by the railroad. Also, they were small, so they could get into small places as the railroad was building through the Sierra Nevada mountains. And one of the biggest difficulties that the Transcontinental Railroad, or that the Central Pacific part of the Transcontinental Railroad had to cover, was crossing the Sierra Nevada. They ended up using the Donner Pass as the most passable route through the Sierra Nevadas. But the Sierra Nevadas are very steep and very rugged with a lot of sheer cliffs, and it made that leg of the railroad incredibly difficult. The movement through the Sierra Nevada, or the construction through the Sierra Nevada, was incredibly slow for the Central Pacific. The Union Pacific was very different. It began in Omaha and worked its way west. It was worked primarily by European immigrants, especially Irish immigrants, and the biggest obstacle for the Union Pacific was Native Americans, who would sometimes attack the workers or attack the railroad line, trying to prevent its construction. The Union Pacific line actually had a full set of train cars moving along just behind the railroad, so that as tracks were laid down, the first train was passing over those tracks. And those train cars carried a number of things. They carried supplies for building the railroads, they carried food supplies, and they also had an armory car that was equipped with weapons to fend off attacks from Native Americans. For both sides, this was incredibly tough and incredibly dangerous work. After all, it was done entirely by hand. They had to go through some pretty tough terrain, through very difficult weather. It was a major, major challenge. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed on May 10th of 1869, when the last spike was driven in at a ceremony at Promontory Point, Utah. This ceremony of driving in the last spike was one of the first mass media events in world history. Telegraphs sent messages to both the east and west coast of this whole ceremony. A ceremonial golden spike was driven in, and then after that ceremonial spike was removed and a steel spike was driven in, a message was sent all across the United States by telegraph that simply said, "Done," marking the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Another major aspect of the frontier and the folklore of the frontier was that of the open range. In 1860, about 5 million longhorn cattle grazed the state of Texas. In Texas, cattle could be sold for about $3 to $5 a head. But if cattle owners could get their herd to the rail lines further north in places like Missouri and later on Kansas and Colorado, they could sell each head of cattle for about $40 a head, so a huge risk for potentially a huge profit. The process of driving cattle from Texas to states like Kansas took about 3 months. Many of the cattlemen, or the owners of the cattle herds, banned drinking, gambling, and cursing during that 3-month period. So the cowboys on the open range, or on the long drive from Texas to Kansas, were held to a pretty strict standard. After all, they were responsible for a whole lot of money that they were driving north. During the period of the open range and the long drive, there were 4 main trails that were used. All of these began in Texas and ended up somewhere further north. The first one to be used was the Sedalia Trail, or sometimes known as the Shawnee Trail, which ended in various parts of Missouri. The Chisholm Trail ended in Abilene, Kansas. The Western Trail, the one that became the most prominent, the most well-known, ended in Dodge City, Kansas. And the Goodnight Loving Trail ended in either Denver or Cheyenne. On this map, you can see those major trails. On the far right, the kind of pinkish colored line would be the Sedalia or Shawnee Trail. The Chisholm Trail is the one in red, kind of in the middle, that ends in both Abilene and Ellsworth, Kansas. The Western Trail, the blue line that goes to Dodge City, Kansas. and finally the Goodnight Loving Trail that goes up to Denver. Each of these trails evolved as the railroad made it further and further west. Initially, the railroad only went to places like St. Louis and Kansas City, so cattle had to be driven to those places. The goal was get the cattle to the railroad where they could be sold for far more than they could be sold in Texas. After 3 months on the cattle drive, 3 months of no drinking, no gambling, no cursing, it was when these cattle drives reached the cow towns in the north, places like Abilene and Dodge City, that what we know as the Wild West really begins. After this long 3 months, the cattle were sold and the cowboys were paid for their entire 3 months' work. And in most cases, they didn't have to report back to work for several months. So they were free to do as they pleased and had lots of money in their pockets, which led to some pretty wild times in places like Dodge City. Dodge City and other cow towns in the north were full of dance halls and hotels and bars and brothels where these now very wealthy cowboys could go and spend all of their hard-earned cash from the last 3 months. The most infamous of these cow towns was Dodge City, Kansas. It had a number of colorful nicknames. It was known as the wickedest little city in America and the cowboy capital of the world. Dodge City, during the heart of the long-range, open-range period, Dodge City was really the heart of this whole atmosphere of the cattle drives and of the cowboys and of the Wild West. It got so wild in Dodge City that the city went out and hired a team of lawmen. You may have heard of them. Guys like Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson and Doc Holliday were hired to try to keep order in Dodge City. Oftentimes we think of this period of the open range and the frontier as having lasted a very long time. But in fact, it only lasted around 15 to 20 years. And by the early 1880s, it had pretty much come to an end. And there were a number of reasons. One, there was such a huge amount of cattle and also sheep on the frontier that land had been severely overgrazed, especially by the sheep, because unlike cattle, sheep eat the grasses and vegetation all the way down to the dirt, leaving nothing for the cattle to eat. So it was a problem driving your cattle north if there was nothing to feed them along the way. Also, the weather had a lot to do with it. Series of droughts at the early part of the 1880s, and in the mid-80s, 2 really, really harsh winters that led to large percentages of the herds being killed or being wiped out, really diminished the cattle drive and open range period. The invention of barbed wire really hurt the open range and the cattle drives because now the frontier and the open range weren't really open anymore. It was being fenced up into sections of private property, which led to a lot of conflicts between the cowboys, the cattle drivers, and the landowners. Ultimately, what ended the frontier was that railroads eventually made it to Texas, and it was no longer profitable to drive cattle hundreds of miles north to the railroads when the railroads were in Texas. So the cattle drives were shrunk down to just driving cattle to the railroads in Texas.